In early 1944, the Central Pacific War reached the arc of atolls that Japan had administered since 1919 as the South Seas Mandate. The Marshall Islands formed a forward shield for the greater naval base at Truk, a line of coral rings with airstrips at Roi-Namur, Kwajalein, Woche, Maloelap, and Jaluit, linking the mandated islands to the Carolines and Marianas. For Tokyo, these outposts protected shipping lanes from the home islands toward the resources of Southeast Asia and served as advanced warning posts against any American thrust from Hawaii. For Washington, the Gilbert Islands operations of November 20th to 23rd, 1943, Tarawa and Macon, opened the door to the Marshalls and exposed systemic issues in planning, naval gunfire, and reef crossing that had to be corrected before attempting the next step. American command relationships were clear. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz oversaw the Central Pacific Drive. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance's Fifth Fleet would carry out the operation. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher's Task Force 58 would screen and strike with fast carriers, and Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner's amphibious forces would land V Amphibious Corps under Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith. Ground assault echelons were assigned by Atoll, the 4th Marine Division under Major General Harry Schmidt for the northern objective of Roi-Namur, and the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division under Major General Charles H. Corlett for the southern objective on Kwajalein Island. Supporting units included underwater demolition teams, Seabees, and specialized amphibian tractor and tank battalions, reflecting lessons from Tarawa's tides, reefs, and strong points. Japanese authority ran from the Imperial General Headquarters to the combined fleet under Admiral Minichi Koga and the 4th Fleet responsible for the mandated islands. On Kwajalein Atoll, Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama directed a predominantly naval garrison built around base forces, naval guard units, construction and aviation personnel reorganized as infantry. These troops occupied dispersed strongpoints, bunkers of reinforced coral and concrete, anti-boat trenches along lagoon beaches, coastal guns sited for interlocking fire, and air installations whose runways had been lengthened through 1943. After heavy losses in the Solomons and the Gilberts, Tokyo's guidance emphasized defense in place, attrit the landings at the waterline, deny airfields, and hold long enough for counterstrikes from the Carolines, contingent on fuel, air strength, and shipping that were increasingly constrained. Public sentiment and expectations differed across the region. In the United States, Tarawa's casualties and imagery produced debate about amphibious doctrine while also confirming the commitment to a direct Central Pacific route toward the Marianas. In Japan, wartime media stressed the perimeter's solidity, but garrison diaries and staff traffic recorded shortages in radar sets, serviceable aircraft, and heavy construction equipment. The Marshallese population, dispersed across atolls with communities concentrated near administrative and aviation sites, had already experienced relocations, labor requisitions, and air raids in late 1943. Many families were moved away from airfields to reduce losses and free space for military works. Intelligence shaped the timetable. U.S. radio intelligence had tracked changes in Japanese orders of battle and supply convoys moving between Truk and the Marshalls in late 1943. Aerial reconnaissance by carrier groups and long-range patrol aircraft plotted gun positions, runway lengths, and newly emplaced revetments. Photographic mosaics indicated concentrated defenses on a few key islands, rather than continuous belts around the atoll. Staff planners compared Tarawa's reef profile with Kwajalene's lagoon approaches, selecting beaches where hydrographic surveys suggested LVTS and LCMS could cross without grounding. Ordnance tables were adjusted. More armor-piercing and delayed fuse bombardment rounds were allocated to penetrate casemates, and close support aircraft loads were tailored to bunker busting and runway denial. Logistics defined feasibility. From Pearl Harbor to the objective area, the amphibious force required sustained at-sea replenishment of fuel, ammunition, and aviation spares. Fleet oilers and escort carriers were scheduled to keep fighter cover over the transports while heavy carriers suppressed outer atolls. Shore party planning accounted for coral dust, limited fresh water, and rapid runway repair once seized. Medical units were reinforced for blast and fragmentation injuries, typical of concrete bunker fighting. Engineering estimates calculated the cubic yards of coral fill needed to restore cratered runways within days, enabling immediate deployment of land-based fighters and bombers to extend the air umbrella westward. Strategically, both sides read the calendar differently. U.S. planners saw a chance to compress the Central Pacific schedule by bypassing several outer atolls and striking directly at the largest and most useful airfield complexes on Kwajalein Atoll, then using them to pressure truck. Japanese staff weighed the risk that committing fleet units to a relief action would expose carriers and battleships to massed U.S. naval aviation before replacement pilots and aircraft could arrive. The result was a defensive stance that relied on fixed fortifications and the hope of delaying actions long enough to deter further advances. By January 1944, the Marshals were thus a convergence point of material capacity, doctrine, and intelligence. The American side assembled carrier groups, specialized landing craft, and an inter-service command structure designed to isolate, land, and expand from narrow lagoon beaches. The Japanese side held individual islands as fortified nodes, short of mobile reserves, but entrenched in order to resist to the last position. The civilian environment was militarized and constrained, with relocations and shortages preceding the assault. With rehearsals complete and shipping marshaled, both commands moved toward an operation that would test whether concentrated firepower and refined amphibious technique could break the atoll shield faster than relief forces could respond. The operation opened with isolation. On January 29th to 30th, 1944, Task Force 58 struck Maloelap, Woche, and then the Northern Marshals to suppress airfields capable of reinforcing Kwajalein. Carrier aircraft, F-6F fighters, SBD dive bombers, and TBF torpedo planes flew repeated sorties to cut runways, destroy parked aircraft, and crater taxiways. Radio intelligence monitored diminished transmissions from these fields, and photomosaics confirmed reduced launch activity before the amphibious force committed to final approach. Night surface groups shelled beacon points and reported no major Japanese sorties from truck during these 2 days. Pre-landing bombardment intensified on January 30th to 31st. Battleships with 14 and 16-inch guns and heavy cruisers with 8-inch batteries engaged bunkers, blockhouses, and coastal guns on Roi-Namur and Kwajalein Island. Destroyers closed to ranges under 6,000 yards to rake trench lines and suspected observation posts with 5-inch fire and VT fuses where available. Underwater demolition teams reconnoitered selected beaches, marking channels, and confirming that lagoon approaches offered navigable water for LVTs. Minesweeping units cleared the outer passages while hydrographic boats rechecked tide tables to align H-hour with favorable lagoon levels. Command posts finalized the first sequence of movements. In the north, the 4th Marine Division under Major General Harry Schmidt organized 2 regimental landing teams against Roi-Namur, planning to land across the lagoon rather than the ocean reef. In the south, the 7th Infantry Division under Major General Charles Corlett targeted the small islets flanking the southern entrance before turning north toward Kwajalein Island itself. The amphibious force under Rear Admiral Richmond, K. Turner, synchronized boat waves with rolling naval fire and scheduled immediate beachhead artillery lift to prevent overshoot onto friendly lines. Fast carrier groups under Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher held combat air patrols overhead and kept strike groups on short notice to engage surviving strong points beyond naval gun range. At dawn on 31st January, the first landings did not go directly onto the main objectives. Army battalions seized adjacent islets south of Kwajalein to emplace 105mm and 155mm guns, radar sets, and beach logistics. Marine assault elements captured small keys west of Roi-Namur for the same purpose, creating artillery and supply nodes that shorten support distances and widen the lagoon approach lanes. LVT-2 troop carriers and LVTA-1 gun. Vehicles ferried the first waves. LCMS followed with M4 tanks, dozers, and engineer squads carrying satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes. Naval beach parties established colored and lettered lanes for traffic control, and shore party companies began bulldozing coral for turnaround points. Japanese reactions matched the doctrine of defense in place. Base Force infantry and naval guard companies manned casemates and anti-boat trenches, firing machine guns and 75mm pieces across mapped kill zones. Telephone links between island positions were intermittent under bombardment. Runners moved between blockhouses with updated fields of fire and requests for mortar ammunition. Orders from Rear Admiral Manzo Akiyama stressed holding runways and denying the lagoon beaches where possible. Limited counter-battery fire came from surviving coastal guns. Some pieces engaged destroyers briefly before being silenced by direct 5-inch hits or by air-delivered bombs. Civilian conditions framed the opening hours. Prior relocations had moved many Marshallese away from airfields, but families remained on islets near work sites and gardens. U.S. Civil Affairs detachments were staged on transports with rations, medical supplies, and interpreters. Initial guidance directed that civilians encountered on seized islets be concentrated away from firing lines and given medical triage. On the Japanese side, labor personnel attached to construction units were folded into defensive companies, reducing specialist capacity for rapid repair once bombardment began. By midday on 31st January, the openings had produced two immediate outcomes. First, outlying islets in both sectors provided artillery platforms and cleared passages, allowing supply echelons to flow through the lagoon with reduced exposure to ocean surf. Second, preliminary fires and carrier strikes forced Japanese units to fight from isolated positions rather than a continuous belt, accelerating the shift from waterline denial to interior strongpoint defense. With these conditions set, both assault echelons prepared to advance onto the principal objectives. The 4th Marine Division across the lagoon toward Roi-Namur's air installations, and the 7th Infantry Division along the southern axis toward the urbanized strip of Kwajalein Island. The next phase would test timing between naval gunfire lifts, armor debarkation points, and close air support as the first full-scale assaults moved from the staging keys to the main beaches. Strategic objectives were explicit. U.S. commanders aimed to seize usable airstrips at Roi-Namur and Kwajalein Island within days, establish fighter and bomber fields to project range toward truck, and reduce the need to assault every atoll by cutting Japanese lateral movement. The ground scheme assigned the 4th Marine Division to capture Roi and Namur from lagoon beaches, then turn the air complex to U.S. use. The 7th Infantry Division would clear the southern islets, take Kwajalein Island block by block, and secure harbors and administrative zones for logistics. Navy goals were to keep carrier air groups over the objectives, neutralize outer atolls, and land shore-based radar, and fighter control teams fast enough to shift air cover ashore. Japanese planning accepted a perimeter economy of force. With limited fleet mobility and pilot reserves, the 4th Fleet and local base forces organized island strongpoints to deny runways and lagoon access as long as possible. Orders emphasized defense in place, dispersal of positions, and interlocking fields of fire over likely boat lanes. Reserve capacity was thin. Small counterattack groups were positioned to strike beaches once naval fire lifted. Coastal guns were sighted to rake channels, while surviving aircraft were to relocate between atolls when practicable, a plan constrained by fuel and cratered runways. Logistics defined feasibility on both sides. U.S. assault echelons loaded LSTs, APAs, and AKAs with pre-packed beach dumps, water, rations, medical modules, 105mm and 155mm ammunition, and aviation matting for runway repair. LVTS were allocated by wave and island, with gun LVTAS scheduled to precede troop carriers by minutes. M4 medium tanks with dozer kits and 75mm guns were assigned to breach anti-boat trenches and destroy casemates at point-blank range, while engineer platoons carried demolitions for bunker entry. Naval construction battalions readied Coral Fill and PSP for immediate airfield work. Evacuation chains routed casualties from beach aid stations to LSTs and hospital ships, with whole blood and plasma stocks apportioned by predicted daily rates based on Tarawa data. Japanese supply tables reflected shortages. Stockpiles of small arms ammunition, mortar rounds, and food were distributed into cave magazines and coral revetments. Concrete and timber had been prioritized for bunkers through late 1943, but heavy machinery for rapid runway repair was scarce. Communications relied on field telephones and runners, with limited radios reserved for artillery direction and coordination with outer posts. Fuel for generators and vehicles was rationed to extend endurance under bombardment. Intelligence and deception shaped the timetable. U.S. planners integrated photomosaics, hydrographic surveys, and radio traffic analysis to select lagoon beaches and schedule bombardment lifts. Dummy signals traffic suggested interest in multiple atolls to diffuse Japanese attention. Beach codes, colored flags, and radar beacons were pre-assigned to reduce confusion under smoke. Civil affairs detachments carried rations, medical supplies, and bilingual guides with instructions to separate civilians from fighting areas as soon as conditions allowed. Japanese counterintelligence depended on censorship and movement controls across the marshals. Once carrier sweeps began, the picture of U.S. intentions narrowed to the most threatened runways. Fires and air support were sequenced to minutes. Battleships and cruisers would open with long-range counter-battery and bunker reduction, then lift inland while destroyers executed direct fire on trenches and pillboxes along selected beaches. Carrier groups planned pre-assault strikes against gun positions that survived surface fire, switching to on-call missions once forward air controllers established radio contact from the beaches. Artillery on seized islets was to register immediately across lagoon objectives to provide rolling concentrations ahead of infantry. Doctrine and training had been adjusted since November 1943. Reef studies informed the decision to commit more LVTs and to land inside the lagoon, rather than across ocean surf where possible. Shore party organizations rehearsed traffic control, with segregated lanes for tanks, engineers, and casualty evacuation. Flame weapons and pole charges, tools shown to be decisive against reinforced casemates, were prioritized for early waves. Communications rehearsals stressed redundant nets between naval gunfire liaison teams, battalion command posts, and air control parties to prevent gaps during critical lifts. Miscalculations persisted on both sides. U.S. estimates correctly identified the concentration of defenses near airfields and administrative zones, but underappreciated the number of deeply buried shelters that would survive initial bombardment. Japanese plans assumed that waterline fire could cripple first waves and that outer atolls could still launch relief sorties. Reductions in serviceable aircraft and the vulnerability of runways under repeated strikes eroded these assumptions. Both commands anticipated rapid decision, U.S. by compression of objectives into a single atoll, Japanese by imposing attrition at the beaches, yet both prepared for protracted bunker fighting if initial expectations failed. Propaganda framed public understanding differently. In the United States, communiques emphasized the stepwise approach across the Central Pacific and the operational link to future moves against Truk and the Marianas. In Japan, official statements highlighted steadfast defense of the mandated islands and the concept of a forward shield, while internal reports tracked declining aircraft availability and damaged communications. With plans synchronized and rehearsals complete, assault units moved to execution dates that aligned carrier cycles, tides, and the establishment of islet artillery bases, setting conditions for the first full-scale landings on the principal objectives. On February 1, 1944, the first full assaults crossed the lagoon. In the north, 4th Marine Division boat waves formed on marked lanes and drove for Roy's airfield and Namur's built-up depot area. LVTA, ones with 37mm guns led by minutes, firing on casemates while naval gunfire lifted inland by prearranged increments. The 23rd and 24th Marines put rifle battalions ashore on lagoon beaches, where hydrographic soundings had promised firmer footing. Roy's airstrip, cratered by previous strikes, offered low cover but limited fields of fire. Marines used dozer-bladed Shermans and pole charges to open taxiway strongpoints. By mid-afternoon, organized resistance on Roi had collapsed, and airfield repair parties began surveying runway panels for early use. Namur developed differently. The The depot quarter and reinforced shelters had survived much of the bombardment. Shortly after noon, an interior blast, traced to a torpedo warhead cache in a concrete shelter, killed Japanese defenders and also Marines advancing nearby, fragmenting unit cohesion and communications for several hours. Local counterattacks by Naval Guard companies and base force rifle groups attempted to exploit the disarray, using grenade bundles and knee mortars to delay the beachhead link-up. Marine battalions re-established control through fire teams and flamethrower sections working bunker to bunker. By nightfall, the perimeter held, but pockets remained inside the tree line and among storage revetments. South of the atoll entrance, the 7th Infantry Division completed its islet chain and pivoted onto Kwajalein Island. Initial landings met fire from interlocked machine gun nests and 75mm guns covering the lagoon's seawall. Assault companies advanced by short bounds, bringing up M4 tanks and 155mm artillery from the captured islets to deliver direct and high-angle fire. Street grids near administrative buildings and warehouses produced short-range engagements. Engineers breached anti-boat trenches and sealed loopholes with satchel charges while infantry cleared interconnected dugouts. Progress was measured in yards, with daily phase lines tied to pre-plotted artillery concentrations. Territorial control shifted hour by hour. On Roi, the entire air complex passed to U.S. hands before evening, enabling immediate planning to land radar teams and fighter control units. On Namur, the Marines controlled the beaches and portions of the interior, but faced continued fire from buried shelters and scattered counterattacks after dark. On Kwajalein Island, the first day secured the southern tip and several inland blocks, opening space for beach dumps and medical stations while leaving a belt of positions to the north intact. Civilian presence affected movement and restraint measures. Marshallese families encountered on cleared islets were gathered by civil affairs detail and moved behind the lines for rations and medical checks. Instructions prohibited the use of civilian structures for fighting positions when feasible. Interpreters documented names and locations for later relocation. Japanese laborers and construction personnel, some pressed into rifle squads, appeared among the captured. Those unarmed were separated for questioning on ammunition caches and shelter layouts. Morale and perception diverged. U.S. assault units reported higher confidence where naval gunfire and tanks could be brought to point-blank ranges. The sudden explosion on Namur and scattered night infiltrations produced local uncertainty that commanders addressed by reinforcing company boundaries and assigning illumination schedules. Japanese defenders, cut off from outer atolls and operating with intermittent telephone lines, shifted to cell-based resistance, guided by pre-marked range stakes and cached grenades. Diaries later recovered described expectations of limited counterattack support and orders to fight from last-ditch shelters once trench networks were disrupted. Unexpected outcomes framed the first engagements. The Roi airfield fell faster than estimates, allowing earlier-than-planned survey for aircraft recovery. Conversely, Namur's internal blast and surviving buried shelters prolonged fighting, despite extensive pre-assault fires. On Kwajalein Island, rubble from bombardment created new cover for both sides, forcing tanks to clear lanes with dozers and delaying scheduled phase line completion. By the night of 1 February, carrier aircraft continued interdiction of nearby islets. Artillery on the southern keys registered across the island, and both assault commands issued orders for renewed attacks at first light to convert fragmented footholds into continuous control of the principal objectives. Reinforcements and fires intensified on February 2nd. Carrier groups maintained continuous strikes on outlying islets, while destroyers executed close-in runs to suppress surviving coastal guns. On Roi-Namur, Marine battalions rolled remaining pockets with coordinated tank infantry teams, employing flamethrowers and pole charges to reduce interlinked shelters. The 4th Marine Division reported consolidated control by the afternoon, enabling radar teams and aviation engineers to begin runway clearance. On Kwajalein Island, the 7th Infantry Division expanded its foothold northward, using registered 105mm and 155mm concentrations to lift by phase line, while M4 tanks breached new barricades formed from collapsed structures. Progress increased exposure to enfilade from isolated bunkers behind the lead companies, forcing repeated pivots to clear the rear before advancing. Command frictions rose with tempo. Naval gunfire schedules required minute-by-minute adjustments to avoid overshooting infantry. Radio nets carried simultaneous calls for smoke, high explosive, and medical evacuation. Shore parties managed growing beach dumps under sporadic shelling, maintaining segregated lanes for ammunition, water, and casualty flow. Heat, coral dust, and blast concussion degraded endurance and communications equipment. Water discipline became a primary concern. Medical officers reported dehydration and heat injuries alongside fragmentation wounds. Japanese defenders faced diminishing options. Telephone lines were cut in multiple sectors. Runners moved under artillery interdiction. Company-sized counterattacks were no longer feasible. Instead, small groups infiltrated after dark to fire knee mortars and throw grenades into bivouacs and aid stations. Ammunition expenditures prioritized automatic fire at close range and retained a reserve of grenades for bunker defense. Orders emphasized denial of runways and the maintenance of final shelters, even if surface positions fell. Some construction and labor personnel, previously unarmed, were issued rifles and folded into ad hoc squads. Casualties rose with close-quarters fighting. By the end of February 2nd, U.S. forces on Kwajalein reported cumulative losses in the hundreds, with ratios varying by battalion depending on exposure to prepared strongpoints and the availability of tank support. Japanese losses were larger in absolute numbers due to the collapse of exposed positions on Roi-Namur and encirclements on Kwajalein Island. Captured personnel included wounded defenders and laborers separated from rifles during bombardment. Comparative figures for the atoll trended towards several thousand Japanese killed versus several hundred U.S. killed and wounded at this stage, reflecting the tactical pattern of bunker reduction and limited opportunities for organized counterattack. Terrain and construction drove the crisis dynamics. Rubble from bombardment created concealed firing points and obstructed tank movement. Dozer-bladed Shermans and engineer teams had to reopen lanes repeatedly. Many bunkers were built with coral and reinforced concrete, vented to the rear and connected by crawl trenches. Flame and demolitions were effective but consumed fuel and explosives quickly, stressing resupply. Cratered streets complicated evacuation. Litter teams and amphibian tractors shuttled casualties along pre-marked routes under intermittent fire. Civilians remained a factor. Marshallese families encountered on cleared blocks were moved behind lines and supplied with water and rations. Interpreters recorded locations of food gardens and cisterns to mitigate shortages. On the Japanese side, civilians and unarmed workers inside military zones were difficult to separate during combat. Where possible, U.S. units directed them to collection points managed by civil affairs detachments. Medical personnel treated blast and burn injuries among both combatants and civilians, triaging for transport to LSTs and hospital ships. Operational risk calculations widened beyond the beachhead. Fleet staff assessed ammunition expenditure rates against the schedule for subsequent operations, including planned strikes toward truck later in February. Carrier air officers balanced interdiction of outer islets with immediate close support, rotating squadrons to preserve serviceability. On the Japanese side, expectations of relief from the Carolines receded as reports of runway damage and fuel constraints accumulated. Surviving radios sent fragmented updates that did not support coordinated action by higher commands. Morale diverged under pressure. U.S. assault companies reported improved confidence where tank infantry coordination was intact and artillery could maintain rolling lifts. Disruptions from night infiltrations and friendly fire hazards during dense fires required repeated reminders on identification and pyrotechnic signals. Japanese defenders' notes recovered later described a transition from perimeter defense to last shelter fighting, with emphasis on conserving grenades and waiting for close targets rather than exposing positions to naval gunfire spotting. International perception tracked communiques. U.S. releases framed the operation as a measured advance following the Gilberts, noting seizure of air facilities and limited ship losses. Japanese announcements highlighted steadfast garrisons and claimed damage to assault shipping. Internally, staff summaries recorded attrition of island communications and the difficulty of coordinating air reinforcement under persistent carrier strikes. By the evening of February 2nd, the battle had escalated into systematic reduction. Continuous artillery, armor-supported infantry in short bounds, and methodical clearing of interlinked positions, while the defenders shifted to disperse cells aiming to delay runway restoration and impose costs during the final blocks of Kwajalein Island. By 3rd February, the fighting concentrated into narrow corridors. On Roi-Namur, Marine regiments finished systematic clearance of the last shelters around the bomb-proofs and torpedo stores, then shifted to airfield restoration. Radar detachments erected sets on Roi, while aviation engineers began filling craters with coral and pierced steel planking. Ammunition point men calculated expenditure rates for flame fuel, pole charges, and 37mm canister for LVTAS, prioritizing remaining stocks for Kwajalein Island, where close-in resistance persisted. On Kwajalein Island, the 7th Infantry Division advanced along a planned axis of blocks and phase lines. Infantry tank teams used M4s with dozer blades to breach anti-boat trenches and collapsed walls. Platoons leapfrogged between rubble mounds, employing demolitions against loopholes and interconnected dugouts. Registered 105mm and 155mm fires lifted in 100 to 200-yard increments, observable by aerial spotters who relayed corrections to battalion fire direction centers. Destroyers moved inside the lagoon to deliver direct 5-inch fire on stubborn casemates sited behind the seawall, then shifted to harassing fire on adjacent islets to reduce night infiltrations. Command decisions focused on tempo and preservation of fire support. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner kept heavy ships on a rolling schedule of ammunition, resupply from accompanying tenders, while Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher maintained continuous combat air patrol and on-call strike sections, delaying longer-range sweeps to ensure immediate response over the island. General Charles Corlett reweighted assault companies to the island's western side, where interlocking fields of fire slowed progress. An additional tank platoon and engineer sections with flamethrowers and satchel charges were reassigned to sectors reporting the densest bunker clusters. Naval Construction Battalion detachments followed within hours to clear lanes and mark casualty evacuation routes. Japanese strongpoints adapted to the loss of perimeter trenches. Surviving defenders organized around deep shelters with rear vents and lateral crawlways, holding grenades and small arms fire until assault teams approached. Knee mortars targeted command posts and aid stations, forcing repeated displacement. Attempts to move small groups by barge between islets after dark were disrupted by patrol craft and illumination rounds. Communications relied on runners. Telephone circuits remained intermittent. Orders prioritized denial of the airstrip and delay of northward movement on the island, accepting isolation of pockets rather than exposing routes to naval gunfire observation. Civilian conditions reached their most constrained stage. On blocks already secured, civil affairs teams concentrated Marshallese families at collection points with water, rice, and medical triage, recording names and locations for later relocation. Reports from interpreters indicated shortages of fresh water on several islets due to crater damage to cisterns. Engineers established temporary storage bladders near beach dumps. Among Japanese labor and construction personnel, some were encountered unarmed and moved to holding areas. Others had been integrated into ad hoc defense cells inside depot zones, complicating separation during active combat. Losses rose as range decreased. By evening of 3rd February, U.S. cumulative casualties on Kwajalein Island had climbed by several hundred for the day, dominated by fragmentation, burns, and small arms wounds suffered during bunker assaults and night infiltrations. Japanese losses mounted as isolated cells were reduced in place. Prisoner counts remained low, with small groups captured when wounded or cut off from ammunition. Medical echelons worked continuous cycles from battalion aid stations to LSTs and hospital ships, using amphibian tractors and marked lanes under smoke when needed. Crucial gains on this date included the full turnover of the Roi-Namur Air Complex to engineer control and the capture of administrative blocks and warehouses on the southern half of Kwajalein Island, providing covered space for supply points and forward aid stations. These positions enabled the landing of additional artillery and facilitated counter-battery fire against remaining guns hidden behind the lagoon's seawall. Shore party officers reported that ammunition and water dumps reached planned capacities, allowing uninterrupted support for the next day's pushes. High-level considerations widened beyond the island. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance's staff assessed the remaining resistance against carrier air group fatigue and ammunition stockpiles, balancing the need to finish clearance quickly with preservation of strength for subsequent February operations in the Central Pacific. Signals intelligence continued to monitor for indications of relief from the Carolines. Intercepted traffic and air reconnaissance suggested no imminent large-scale intervention, reinforcing the choice to keep the main carrier weight over the objective. Nightfall brought the densest cycle of infiltrations and local counterattacks of the operation. Trip flares and prearranged illuminations and schedules limited movement in front of company lines, but several penetrations reached logistics areas, resulting in brief close-range engagements around dumps and aid stations before being contained. The experience reinforced the requirement to pair every forward movement in daylight with a systematic sweep of rear positions before dark, preserving communications and preventing disruption of medical and supply chains. By the end of 3rd February, the campaign had reached its peak effort. Continuous artillery and naval gunfire coordination, armor working at point-blank distances, engineer-led demolition of interlinked shelters, and carrier air on immediate call. For the defenders, the peak expressed as a transition to final shelter resistance aimed at delaying runway restoration and imposing casualties inside a shrinking footprint. The following day's orders reflected converging expectations on both sides: a push to close the remaining pockets on Kwajalein Island while maintaining isolation of adjacent islets, and a continuation of cell-based resistance wherever buried shelters and ammunition still allowed organized fire. Adaptation emerged on both sides on February 4th. Assault battalions on Kwajalein Island reorganized for block-by-block clearance with tighter tank infantry engineer teams. Platoon leaders paired each M4 with a designated engineer section for flamethrowers and satchel charges, while rifle squads carried extra pole charges and smoke to mask bunker approaches. Battalion command posts shifted forward by bounded moves to shorten radio circuits. SCR sets were cross-checked on prearranged authentication to reduce misfires during close naval gunfire support. Shore parties redrew traffic lanes, so ammunition and water moved on separate routes from casualty evacuation, limiting night disruptions when infiltrators probed dumps with grenades. Fire support procedures were refined. Artillery on the southern islets registered shorter lifts and increased use of smoke for blind corners along the lagoon's seawall. Destroyers conducted repeated direct fire runs inside 4,000 yards against casemates that survived bombardment, then displaced laterally to complicate Japanese range estimation. Carrier strike sections held on 5-minute alert for pre-briefed aim points. Forward air controllers established reliable line of sight from rooftops and crater lips, passing concise target numbers to avoid duplicate fires. Engineers introduced methodical ladder drills, mark vents, seal loopholes, force flame into rear openings, and place time charges only after confirming adjacent crawl trenches were blocked. Defenders adapted to the loss of surface trenches by converting depth into time. Small cells rotated between bomb proofs, preserving knee mortar ammunition for command posts and radios rather than open skirmish lines. Machine guns were held until assault teams entered fixed arcs, then fired in short bursts to conserve barrels and avoid spotting by destroyers. Ammunition was redistributed at night by 2- and 3-man teams crawling along pre-marked rubble paths. Where telephone circuits failed, runners carried strip maps of fields of fire to adjacent shelters to maintain interlock across alleys and seawall breaks. Resource management shaped tempo. U.S. quartermasters calculated daily requirements for flame fuel, demolition charges, 75mm tank rounds, and water per assault company. Resupply was staged in pre-packed loads timed to phase line completion, rather than by ad hoc requests. Medical officers adjusted litter team ratios and set fixed evacuation intervals, moving serious cases to LSTs within hours to free beach aid stations. Japanese stocks of small arms ammunition and grenades declined, with reports from captured notes indicating rationing to last 2 to 3 days at anticipated rates. Generator fuel for radios and lighting was conserved by strict schedules, reducing internal communication windows and complicating coordination for counterattacks. Both sides improvised against terrain. Rubble funnels that trapped tanks were converted into controlled lanes with engineer tape and mine probes. Dozer blades pushed coral fill to bridge anti-boat trenches. Defenders rigged tripwires to delay flame teams and used rear vents as grenade chutes. Assault squads countered by sandbagging vents before ignition. Where seawall curves created defilade, infantry advanced under overlapping smoke pots and used periscopes to identify loopholes before exposing gunners. Countermeasures against night infiltrations matured. Company perimeters incorporated trip flares, overlapping automatic rifle sectors, and prearranged illumination from 60mm mortars onto numbered panels. Listening posts were staggered and rotated every 2 hours to limit fatigue. Patrol craft enforced lagoon interdiction with star shell patterns and 150 caliber fire along likely barge routes, reducing successful movements between islets. Defenders responded by shifting to single-cell probes aimed at aid stations and radio sites rather than broad penetrations. Psychological strain was managed by routine. Assault companies enforced rest cycles of 2 to 4 hours as blocks were secured. Chaplains and surgeons recorded rising cases of blast concussion and dehydration alongside combat wounds. Leaders emphasized briefings that restated map objectives, fire support windows, and recognition signals at every bound to mitigate confusion in dust and smoke. Japanese diaries later recovered described instructions to conserve rounds for close targets, maintain silence under bombardment, and avoid exposing firing ports until assault teams committed to an approach, accepting isolation of pockets as the cost of endurance. Civilian measures adapted as control expanded. Civil affairs teams relocated Marshallese families from newly cleared sectors to rear collection points with recorded rosters and water distribution schedules. Interpreters compiled sketches of cisterns, gardens, and work areas to prioritize repair and prevent shortages. Among Japanese labor personnel inside depot zones, separation from combatants proceeded case by case. Those unarmed were directed to holding areas, while others remained embedded in defense cells until positions were reduced. Innovation also meant sequencing. Once a block was cleared, engineers immediately mapped vent systems and marked safe corridors for subsequent echelons. Artillery observers shifted registration to the next phase line before infantry advanced, compressing pauses between bounds. Carrier groups adjusted sortie cycles to preserve fighter coverage while rotating strike aircraft through maintenance, sustaining a constant on-call package without exhausting squadrons. By the end of February, adaptation produced measurable effects. U.S. assault elements advanced at a steadier rate, with fewer friendly fire incidents and more predictable resupply, while casualty evacuation times shortened. Japanese resistance, concentrated into durable shelters, continued to inflict losses at close range, but showed decreasing capacity for coordinated action or movement between pockets. The psychological balance reflected these material trends. Assault units reported greater confidence tied to reliable fires and logistics, and defender notes pointed to an emphasis on last shelter endurance rather than counterattack, setting conditions for a decisive compression of the remaining defended area. The turning point formed on February 4th to 5th as 3 conditions converged. First, the complete capture of Roi-Namur allowed shore-based radar and fighter direction to come online, replacing exclusive reliance on carrier controllers, with ground-controlled interception operating from Roi. Combat air patrol cycles tightened, and close support aircraft were available within minutes rather than tens of minutes, shrinking the defenders' windows to shift positions or move ammunition at night. Second, artillery mass increased decisively, with additional 105mm and 155mm pieces emplaced on the southern islets and along cleared blocks, the 7th Infantry Division executed rolling barrages in 100 to 150-yard lifts, synchronized to tank bounds, cutting remaining crawl trenches and burying vent systems that had enabled repeated reoccupation of reduced shelters. Third, Japanese local command coherence deteriorated after the loss of several shelter hubs and the reported death of Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama during the earlier fighting on Namur. Surviving sector leaders issued orders by runner with shrinking ammunition and limited radio time. Terrain that had previously slowed the advance now favored envelopment. Tanks used newly bulldozed lanes to bypass strong points and attack them from rear vents, while destroyers firing inside the lagoon completed casemate reductions that artillery could not reach. Forward air controllers on rooftops and crater rims coordinated short-duration strikes to seal loopholes moments before infantry closed. The cumulative effect was spatial compression. By February 5th, the defended footprint on Kwajalein Island had narrowed to a series of pockets north of the administrative quarter, separated by rubble fields that assault companies controlled by day and illuminated at night. Quantitatively, the balance shifted in supporting fires and attrition. U.S. artillery fired thousands of rounds in 24 hours across pre-plotted grids, while destroyers conducted multiple direct fire runs within 4,000 yards. Casualties on the attacking side remained in the hundreds for the operation to date, with daily fluctuations tied to bunker assaults and night infiltrations. Japanese losses climbed into the thousands as isolated cells were destroyed in place. Prisoners remained comparatively few, consisting mainly of wounded personnel and laborers. The majority of defenders fought from final shelters until overrun. Ammunition consumption rates showed the new pattern. Reduced small arms expenditure in open firefights, but high usage of flame fuel, satchel charges, and 75mm tank rounds at short range. Operationally, the turning point was defined less by a single assault than by continuity of pressure. With fighter direction ashore, destroyer gunnery adjusted rapidly to spotter calls, and artillery lifts met schedule despite heat and dust. Medical evacuation lines held under illumination, preventing backlog at beach aid stations and sustaining tempo. Shore parties achieved planned water and ammunition stock levels, enabling battalions to attack without pause for resupply halts that defenders had previously exploited after dark. For the Japanese side, the implications were immediate. Attempts to regroup for a counterattack could not assemble critical mass under constant observation and fire. Knee mortar teams continued to strike command posts and aid stations, but each sortie consumed irreplaceable ammunition. Generator fuel for radios and lighting ran low, compressing communication windows to minutes and forcing reliance on runners across ground now covered by prearranged defensive fires of the attackers. Orders emphasized conserving grenades for assault approaches and holding shelters to the last. Movement between pockets largely ceased. Civilian conditions reflected the same shift. On cleared blocks, civil affairs teams expanded rosters and water distribution points, extracted families from areas scheduled for the next day's barrages, and gathered information on cisterns and gardens to prevent shortages. Within remaining defended areas, civilians and labor personnel were increasingly confined inside military zones as fighting contracted to the northern strip. Separation proceeded only when pockets collapsed. Psychologically, the turning point was recognized in routine rather than declaration. Assault companies reported that fire support requests produced timely effects, and that night infiltrations declined in reach as illumination patterns matured. Defender notes later recovered emphasized silence, short controlled bursts, and waiting for point-blank targets, but acknowledged that loss of lateral movement removed the possibility of coordinated counteraction. By the evening of February 5th, commanders on both sides adjusted expectations. U.S. forces issued orders for continuous block clearance aimed at total control within days, while Japanese instructions focused on last shelter resistance and denial of specific buildings and remaining communications nodes. The momentum had shifted irreversibly towards systematic reduction of the final pockets on Kwajalein Island. Combat tapered into clearance actions on February 6th to 7th. On Kwajalein Island, remaining pockets north of the administrative quarter were isolated with bulldozed lanes and continuous artillery harassment. Assault companies advanced under short lifts and rooftop forward air control, reducing shelters with flame and demolitions. By evening of February 6th, organized resistance was limited to scattered strongpoints. Overnight infiltrations diminished under prearranged illumination. On February 7th, the Atoll Command declared the objective secured, ending Operation Flintlock's combat phase after 8 days from the initial carrier strikes. Withdrawals were unequal. Japanese forces had no route for evacuation. Surviving groups either fought to destruction inside shelters or were captured when wounded or cut off from ammunition. Captured records and interrogations indicated initial garrison totals on key islands in the thousands, drawn from base forces, naval guard units, and labor and aviation personnel, reorganized as infantry. U.S. forces reported only small numbers of prisoners taken relative to estimated defenders. Those captured included wounded Japanese and Korean laborers, as well as unarmed construction workers separated from units during bombardment. Casualty reporting began as clearance proceeded. Preliminary U.S. figures for the atoll indicated several hundred killed and over 1,000 wounded across Marine and Army units, with battalion-level variation tied to exposure at Namur's depot area and to the density of strongpoints on Kwajalein Island. Japanese losses were recorded in the thousands killed, with a few hundred prisoners tallied across the atoll once medical screening and processing concluded. Medical departments noted that a large share of U.S. wounds resulted from fragmentation and burns during bunker assaults. Among the defenders, blast and flame effects dominated alongside small arms wounds inside confined spaces. Administrative tasks followed immediately. Naval Construction Battalion detachments and Army engineers began systematic clearance, marking and neutralizing unexploded ordnance, probing vent systems, and collapsing unsafe shelters. Graves registration teams organized burial details. Shore parties shifted beach dumps from assault supply to garrison stockpiles, while port reconstruction units surveyed lagoon facilities for lighterage and longer-term anchorage. Civil affairs detachments expanded rosters of marshallese families, established ration schedules, and coordinated basic medical care. Interpreters documented cistern damage and garden plots to prioritize repair and prevent water shortages. Redeployment planning overlapped with stabilization. Elements of the 4th Marine Division prepared to return to staging areas after turning Roi-Namur air operations over to engineers and aviation units. The 7th Infantry Division redistributed companies to security and labor for clearance, then conducted local patrols across adjacent islets to confirm isolation and remove remaining resistance. Carrier groups rotated squadrons for maintenance while maintaining combat air patrol. Heavy ships began replenishment cycles at sea to restore ammunition for subsequent operations. Airfield restoration advanced as a central objective of the aftermath. On Roi, engineers filled craters with coral and laid pierced steel planking. Radar and fighter direction units completed calibration. On Kwajalein Island, runway repair and dispersal area, clearance progressed block by block as ordnance was removed. Within days, land-based fighters and reconnaissance aircraft operated from Roi, reducing reliance on carriers for local air cover and enabling strikes westward. Humanitarian measures and security proceeded in parallel. Civilian movement was controlled to keep families away from ordnance clearance. Rations and water distribution increased as rosters were verified. Hospital ships received both U.S. and Japanese wounded. Medical screening separated those requiring evacuation from those suitable for local care. Prisoner handling followed theater policy, segregation of combatants from laborers, registration, interrogation for information on caches and minefields, and transfer to rear areas once transport was available. International communications framed closure and next steps. U.S. communiques announced the capture of the principal objectives in the marshals and the seizure of airfields, linking the result to forthcoming operations deeper in the Central Pacific. Japanese statements emphasized continued resistance on scattered islands and damage inflicted on assault forces. Internal traffic recorded the loss of the atoll, and the consequent exposure of lines between Truk and the remaining mandated islands. Operationally, withdrawal meant transition rather than departure. Assault echelons handed terrain to garrison, air, and support units. Naval forces restored magazines and rotated for maintenance. Staff finalized timelines for operations scheduled for mid to late February. Intelligence teams exploited captured documents, maps, and code materials from headquarters shelters on Namur and administrative buildings on Kwajalein Island, correlating them with radio traffic to assess remaining strength across the Carolines and Outer Marshalls. By the end of the immediate aftermath, Kwajalein Atoll functioned as a forward base. The lagoon supported anchorage and logistics. Roi-Namur provided fighter control and reconnaissance, and Kwajalein Island offered storage and administrative capacity once clearance reduced hazards. The shift from combat to occupation completed the transition envisioned in planning. Land the assault echelons, secure airfields and harbor space, and prepare the atoll to support the next phase of operations without extended pause. The campaign's legacy lay in proof and precedent. Operational results demonstrated that concentrated carrier aviation, prearranged naval gunfire, and lagoon-side landings using LVTs could take a fortified atoll within days if isolation was achieved in advance. The atoll yielded airfields and anchorages that immediately extended range toward the Carolines. From positions secured after January 31st to February 7th of 1944, U.S. forces scheduled follow-on moves. The carrier raids against Truk on 17th to 18th February, and the seizure of Eniwetok in mid to late February, compressing the Central Pacific timetable by bypassing outer marshals, previously marked for separate attacks. Japanese planners assessed that loss of the marshals removed the forward warning layer for Truk, and narrowed options for counterattack to localized actions under air and naval disadvantage. Comparative figures entered doctrine and public discourse. Across Kwajalein Atoll, the defenders' dead numbered in the thousands with a few hundred prisoners, while U.S. forces recorded several hundred killed and over 1,000 wounded. Ratios varied by sector, with higher U.S. losses where interior shelters survived bombardment, and where night infiltrations reached aid stations. Staff studies correlated these outcomes with munition mixes, LVTA allocation, and the timing of artillery lifts, informing standardized tables for flame fuel, demolitions, and 75mm tank ammunition in subsequent atoll operations. The Japanese side cataloged ammunition expenditure, failures in telephone networks, and the consequences of fuel and aircraft shortages, shaping later guidance to deepen shelters and disperse depots even further on remaining islands. For the Marshallese population, the aftermath altered daily life and future governance. Civil affairs rosters documented relocations during the battle and the consolidation of families after clearance, while damage to cisterns and gardens required organized repair and ration schedules. The atoll's transformation into a forward base shifted labor patterns and movement controls through 1944 to 1945. Post-war, Kwajalein's facilities supported continued U.S. military use, and the broader Marshall Islands entered a trusteeship with long-term negotiations over land, compensation, and repatriation. These processes linked community memory of 1944, fighting to later debates about basing and sovereignty. Strategically, the operation influenced route selection and tempo. Central Pacific planning validated the decision to bypass multiple strongpoints in favor of key airfields and harbors, while the Southwest Pacific advance continued along New Guinea and the Netherlands East Indies. The combined effect created converging pressures on the inner defense zone. Japanese naval aviation, already reduced by attrition in 1943, could not reconstitute quickly enough to contest both routes once Kwajalein and subsequent objectives shortened Allied logistics lines and increased sortie rates from land bases. Doctrinally, several lessons persisted. Land on the lagoon where hydrography allows. Pair each tank with engineers trained in vent identification and flame employment. Schedule destroyer, direct fire inside the lagoon to supplement artillery. Move fighter direction ashore as soon as runways are usable, and enforce rear area sweeps after each bound to reduce night infiltrations. counter lessons on the defending side emphasize deeper overhead cover, redundant venting, dispersed command posts, and rationing of ammunition for final shelter fighting, acknowledging that without mobile reserves or external relief, attrition would culminate in isolated pockets. Commemoration and historical debate focus on three themes. First, whether pre-assault bombardment densities were sufficient against deeply buried shelters, measured against later operations that increased armor piercing and delayed fuse allotments. Second, how casualty exchange rates reflected the interaction of fortification design and assault sequencing rather than generalized superiority. Third, the civilian dimension. Records of relocations, medical care, and property damage inform assessments of occupation policies and post-war claims. Veterans' accounts from Marine, Army, and naval units, Japanese garrison diaries, and Marshallese oral histories form parallel sources that, when compared, highlight common constraints: water, ammunition, communications, and differing priorities, runway denial, block-by-block clearance, and family preservation. In the wider course of the war, Kwajalein marked the first penetration of the mandated island shield's core and showed that combined arms amphibious method could be repeated at scale. Its immediate operational outputs, airfields on Roi-Namur and lagoon anchorage, enabled the February strikes that degraded Truk's role as a major fleet base and set conditions for the Marianas campaign later in 1944. The atoll thus occupies a place where tactical technique, strategic reach, and civilian experience intersect, and where subsequent interpretations measure planning assumptions against results recorded in unit logs, intelligence summaries, and community records from the same week of combat.